The Seeds of an Empire, RK equals, Part 3, RK equals, Senate Building, Coruscant. Anakin had mixed feelings about the situation, both the one he found himself in and that of the Republic as a whole. On a personal level, he resented the fact that he was excluded from many of the meetings Padmé held nowadays. It was yet another reminder of the fact that his judgment was suspect and people didn't trust him. On the other hand, having to personally deal with the politics that were his wife's bread and butter would have driven him insane in a short order. It didn't help that the Chancellor's security detail watched him like hungry birds of prey. They didn't trust him either. On another level, while Anakin knew that what happened to Kuat was tragedy, he couldn't help but think that they had it coming. It was a public secret that Kuat betrayed the Republic by refusing to send aid to Corellia. Their government was directly responsible for the dire straits the galaxy was in and shared the blame with the madmen of the Jedi Council. The only reason he resented if not hated the Council outright more than Kuat was that it was the Jedi who murdered his friend and mentor. Well, not quite. It was hard to consider Palpatine really dead, when his ghostly form had been haunting him for weeks now. The conversations they held were enlightening. Speaking about Palpatine, the former Chancellor emerged through the closed door of the Chancellor's office and shook his head. He had a glum expression on his face, which was a message enough. "I see." Anakin sent through the odd force bonds they began to share lately. Its greatest benefit was that he no longer needed to speak aloud for Palpatine to hear him, which was great because Padmé already caught him twice talking to himself. Obviously, she had been very concerned and he was barely able to beg off a mental evaluation. "Do you really, my friend?" Palpatine seethed. "To think that I wasted decades of my life trying to help those fools. That bad?" Anakin knew that the Skyfall lit up a fire under everyone's feet, however he has been mostly out of the loop. Ever since the crisis began, Padmé barely had time to exchange a few words with him, and during the few minutes they spent alone she definitely didn't want to think about politics. She made great arguments about not doing it, the kind he wholeheartedly agreed with. "You know, I knew Padmé since she was a slip of a girl no higher than my knee. I don't need these images of her in my head," Palpatine chided. It was hard for Anakin to keep his bored expression on instead of blushing. "What has you so angry this time? Besides not needing to know what you do with your wife when you two are alone?" Palpatine grumbled. "Everything is falling apart. Satine Kenobi lacks the contacts and alliances needed to keep the Republic's divisions from tearing it from within. I'll grant her this much, it should have been close to impossible to keep things together after the Jedi coup and the stunts Kuat pulled, yet she somehow did it. Your advice helped." "Of course it did." Palpatine scoffed. "It's still not enough. The fools are once again letting their petty grievances and ambitions get into the way of what's best for the Republic and the whole galaxy," he spat. "Someone needs to keep them in line." That was a conclusion Anakin reached months ago. The Chancellor's hands are tied, hers even more than mine were. There must be a way to make them listen. Anakin fumed too. "Perhaps there is, my friend. Perhaps there is." RK equals, Officer Quarters, Republic Cruiser Victory, Hyperspace. For the first time since the dark side pulled a fast one on me, I felt somewhat relaxed. The reason was clear, as if I needed a reminder of the warm, naked body pressed in my side. It wasn't until a few hours ago that we finally found some time for ourselves, and what followed was a rough fucking to make us forget for a bit everything but ourselves. It worked too, but now as I laid in bed with Bo sleeping beside me, everything began surfacing again. The way the dark side pulled a fast one and made me forget myself. Or actually remember who I was. I owed Arya a big one for saving me from becoming exactly what I hated. I kept telling myself that it wasn't all bad. With the help of the Force and modern medical science, I was back more or less in one piece, even if there were some internal injuries that would take the rest of the week to heal unless I got a swim in Bacta, which was out of the question with all medical supplies that we could spare needed back on Kuat. Zash was recovering nicely too. And even in my mind I was dancing around the real issues. A few brief chats with a harried Obi-Wan made it crystal clear that the political situation at Coruscant was unraveling. Unless something drastic happened, by this time next week there might not be anything of the Republic left but the GAR left hanging without the support structure it needed. Luckily, Inara Kuat survived and was all too glad to follow a few suggestions from Zash before my former master ended up on the operating table to patch up her messed up chest. That's why even now we were racing towards Coruscant with Inara, the Quati Prime Minister and one of their admirals on board. I smiled at that thought. Who would have believed that Panka would have a use? Both the Admiral and Prime Minister would follow Inara's lead. Panka wasn't going to be an issue. After all, if he ever had an original thought in his head, I would be very surprised. The Prime Minister, well, he would back anything that would keep Kuat safe or at least wouldn't hurt his homeworld. More importantly, he would be able to help sell the plans I was still busy formulating to his government and the Quati citizens. Said plans were something of a long shot. I would be overstepping any and all authority I had by a lot, and the consequences of failure were simply unacceptable. I've known that the Republic was a lost cause ever since my return from Mandalore. What I never expected was that I would need to engage into empire building this early. At least Tarkin's stunt with the Mid-Rim Alliance was going to come in very useful once we got back to Coruscant. It was another question what I would need to do to keep said alliance happy with me once they learned what I was about to do in their name, even if some of its members claimed to be on board with replacing the Republic with something that would serve our collective interests better. One of the first things I would be doing after arrival would be speaking with Satine, to figure out exactly how deep a hole we found ourselves into, and then Palpy in order to milk him for more of his plans for establishing the Empire, co-opt them and promise the powers that be that Satine would be a figurehead answering to them. Not that I had any intention of leaving those pains in my ass with a say how the galaxy was ran for any longer than absolutely necessary, but they didn't need to know that. What I really needed was to buy time to stabilize the military situation so we could spend some time uncriffing the political one. At least I did know how to deal with some of our current military problems, and if my vague plans panned out, ruining the Confederacy's year might just be in the cards. RK equals Part 4 RK equals Many people of all stripes all over the galaxy aided the birth of the Empire. A number of them pushed for policies and had agendas that ultimately led to strengthening of central authority within the Republic, with the Satine regime serving as both a justification and inspiration. Movements of all kinds, with the Commission for the Protection of the Republic, COMPA, being a prime example, sprouted overnight once the Clone Wars began. What many of them had in common was the goal: strengthen the Republic, especially its central authority through the office of the Chancellor, support the war effort and keep morale up. To that effect, COMPA and its rival organizations engaged in creation and spread of propaganda all over the galaxy. COMPA itself was particularly supportive of Sheev Palpatine as a wartime chancellor, and many of its members believed that the Jedi murdered the last, best hope for the Republic with his assassination. For months, the Commission was left floundering, a state made worse by key members being wounded, missing or dead during the various clashes coinciding with the Senate ended up locked up in inaction. Initially, COMPA offered Chancellor Kenobi cool welcome. Few believed that she could fill Palpatine's shoes, a frankly impossible task. Yet, as weeks passed and she did her best to keep the Republic together and prosecute the war, more and more Commission members began to change their tunes. That shift started within the Republic military itself, which perhaps should have been expected considering that the Chancellor's husband was the Supreme Commander and by all accounts he was doing a great job in spite the monumental task in front of him. It was primarily through her husband's efforts that Chancellor Kenobi found her foot in with COMPA. Notably, the Commission was one of the few organizations that hailed the clone soldiers as elite guardians of the Republic. That would ultimately give them mixed results when a number of clone units refused to accept the Kenobi regime as legitimate. However, it should be kept in mind that certain members of the Commission were gleeful supporters of the new regime since its inception, though their connection with key players within it discredited their efforts to bring its power to bear in its support earlier. A notable such member was Senator Orn Free Tar from Ryloth. He owed the liberation of his homeworld and the salvation of hundreds of thousands if not millions of his people from slavery to General Vale before he even became Mandalore. On the other hand, many Akompa members saw Chancellor Kenobi wield her power as effectively as she was allowed and agitated for the Senate and the various local governments to untie her hands so she could lead the Republic to victory. That was the same freedom they wanted Palpatine to enjoy. It is by no means an understatement to say that high-ranking commission members played key roles during the Coruscant Summit. One such man was Bino Doughton, a native of Eriadu and a friend of Admiral, now Moff, Wilhuff Tarkin. He was a founding member of Compa and amongst the first to agitate for support of the Satine regime. Doughton was a key person behind Compa's propaganda campaigns and thus his support was invaluable in laying down the foundations for public support of the future empire. One thing about Compa that is understated often is the influence that various famous artists, holonet celebrities, reporters, actors and even bloggers had. Those were people who the regular citizens followed, sometimes even religiously, and helped shape and direct public perception with their support and propaganda. Yet many still concentrate upon the powerful military and political figures who are members of Compa, forgetting that there are different kinds of useful influence. Rise of an empire, Compa to Compa. From preserving the Republic to establishing the new order. RK equals Chancellor Residence, Senate Building, Coruscant. I'm not sure if congratulations or condolences are in order. I smirked at Obi-Wan. A moment of levity felt appropriate considering the monumental task we had in front of us. Besides, we couldn't really start before the Chancellor finished throwing up in the fresher with Bo hovering protectively over her sister. Kenobi's only response was only a dirty look sent my way. Soon though, both of them came back and my wife dropped on the sofa beside me while Satine went to curl next to Obi-Wan. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed before the Chancellor cleared her throat. I may be damned for even thinking about it, however we're willing to listen. Satine looked and sounded as if she was on her last legs, even if her dress looked ready for a gala. Even her hair was beyond reproach, yet that only reinforced how knackered her drawn face appeared in comparison with her outfit. Obi-Wan on the other hand looked as if he came out of a week of combat with the only respite being a shower and a fresh set of deep green uniform. If that was the consequence of a few days dealing with the latest galactic crisis, it simply reinforced why I didn't want to be the one actually running the bloody galaxy. I had to keep a smirk from surfacing. My conscience might be back with a vengeance, yet I still was a selfish bloody bastard and didn't want the job. My friends, I guess, weren't going to thank me for what I was about to drop in their laps. Everything you've told me, not to mention a short chat with Palpy's ghost and the Skywalkers confirmed it, points to a simple conclusion. The Republic is done for. I know. Satine growled at me. It was cute really, she looked like a rather furious royal kitten at that moment. Obi-Wan slipped a hand around her waist and then squeezed her hand. All I had to do the last few days to keep the illusion going meant hammering another nail in its coffin, and it still isn't enough. She fumed. Well, Satine was the Chancellor even if she didn't take the post to help preserve the Republic. It was just what Mandalore needed. It was too bad, or perhaps opportune if we managed to pull off our crazy scheme, that it was close to an impossible task. At least Zash should be on her feet tomorrow evening for when the meetings began. Ahsoka was mending well too and should be back to her troops, something she was very relieved of when I saw her in Vicky's med bay before we reached Coruscant. I got my thoughts back into order and again thought on how to best handle this. Those two weren't going to thank me for it. We don't waste any more time with a lost cause besides keeping appearance for the general public. I began. Obi-Wan was the first to get a clue what I was on about, and he narrowed his eyes dangerously at me. It took Satine longer, probably due to how exhausted she was combined with her pregnancy. We take steps to formalize your position as a dictator and in the fullness of time make it official. In the process we give our allies exactly what they want but could never get if a proper democratic republic is restored in the future. You're talking about an empire, precisely what the Council accused you of pursuing in the first place. Obi-Wan accused. And it was in no small part due to their actions we're in this mess with no good options left. Empress and Emperor Kenobi, it has nice ring to it, doesn't it? No one would accept this. Satine protested. Not unless they believe you to be merely a figurehead facilitating their desires and greed. Kuat is on board. Mandalore too, not to mention the Mid-Rim Alliance. Now, Obi-Wan understood, and I marveled on his self-control. I was pretty sure that if Satine wasn't right here, pregnant with his kid too, he might have drawn his lightsaber with me. That's why you helped build that alliance. Obi-Wan snapped. His fury was very much un-Jedi-like, and Satine wasn't far behind. Well, the politicians I met on Naboo were there to gain favor with Palpatine, in no small part because they saw him as someone who had to become a dictator to keep things in line, and thus as someone who could have actually addressed their grievances by sidestepping the Senate if given the right incentives. Needless to say, one of the pinnacles of said alliance was pursuing a new order more friendly to their interests. It was the same deal we were going to give the major powers in the core, that would be the carrot. The stick, perceived full Mandalorian support backing the GAR, which was still dominated by clones who would follow legitimate orders, and of course the specter of the Confederacy war crimes. Soon that would be changing, and we would all be busy earning the allegiance of the volunteer army groups and fresh fleet elements, but that was a concern for a later time. It was a dangerous plan, one that if mishandled would see us fighting a second civil war. In a hindsight, it was a good thing that my people had a few bolt holes prepared if everything went really wrong. I pushed such thoughts away. I couldn't afford to run, this mess needed straightening out. This is what Mandalore needs, sister. Bo finally decided to be helpful. This can doom us all. Satine countered. Even if I for some insane reason wanted to entertain this insanity, how do we even convince the right people to back it? She snapped at me. It very well might. If, when the Republic finally flies apart, we're criffed anyway, I said aloud the obvious truth we all knew. This place is as secure as it could be, so let's put all cards on the table. I did make sure of it while Satine was busy hurling in the fresher. Palpatine was the Sith Lord behind the war. He laid the foundations of an empire, and with his death and curfew all contingencies, the Republic for all intents and purposes died. We pick up the pieces and put them back together as well as we can. Deals, promises, blackmail, outright threats, whatever it takes. The price to pay for sure is that for the time being, you, my dear sister-in-law, will be a figurehead reigning at the whims of fools I won't trust with burned-down empty warehouse. You'll have to keep the powers of the core more or less in line until we can resolve the clone wars. Once that is done and we can consolidate power, I can assure you, we'll do everything we have to make sure you'll rule, not reign. Because none of us trusts the idiots who created this mess in the first place to run the galaxy if we have any choice at all. Bo helpfully pointed out. Surprisingly enough, Obi-Wan didn't take the revelation that Palpy was a Sith, the one behind the war in the first place, in fact, all too well, though he surely had to suspect. At least even in death he was ready, eager even to ensure that the Republic that was such a pain in the ass in life would end, replaced by an empire no less. I was sure he still hoped to get back to the top once we helped him get a new body, though needless to say none of us really had an intention to allow him the opportunity to become even more of a threat. Then again, if mishandled, such a transfer could cut someone's raw power in the Force by at least a half, so that was a thought too. I continued to ponder while the Kenobis were busy processing the bombshell I just dropped in their laps, the seeds of an empire. RK equals. Part 5. RK equals. Unconfirmed details, often second-hand knowledge and hearsay, claim that the Coruscant summit had a domino effect going. First, it was the Kenobis and Vale, and through them the Mandalorian people and the Mid-Rim Alliance backed the ideals of further centralizing and restructuring the Republic government. They were almost immediately backed by multiple senators representing the then cut-off alliance, high-ranking military officers like Admiral Coburn and General Valentra, along with many ministers within the Republic government itself, and with them support of their departments generally followed. Next came Kuat, which in hindsight shouldn't have been surprising. The Skyfall put into motion the events that would change how KDY and the Quati government would be ran, and the first thing was their backing for what would become known as the Imperial faction within the Republic. Those were the first dominoes to fall, and they had profound power behind them. Rise of an Empire, the Coruscant Summit. =RK= Chancellor Residence. Senate Building. Coruscant. Obi-Wan's mind froze. He had suspected that Palpatine might have been traitor, not simply a dark side-aligned force adept too afraid to reveal himself. Suspected, but without proof. He didn't want it to believe it for many a reason, not the least of them being that it would be an admission of how easily and completely he and the rest of the Jedi had been played for decades at that. Perhaps it was his pride in his skills and abilities, or just pride itself with nothing to really back it, that made him for a moment dismiss Vale's words. Then they hit in full force, and he had to ask himself the logical questions: how the Sith knew, how long he knew, and why didn't he say a thing about it until now? Mistrust flared in his chest, and his arm closed protectively around Satine. The Force trembled around him, stricken by his shaking emotions. His lightsaber began twitching because of the need to grab it and bring it down to the smug bastard sitting across the small caf table. Yet, Obi-Wan Kenobi, a former Jedi, the negotiator and the supreme commander of the Republic military, just sat because he was a husband to and a father-to-be. He had a perfect opportunity to go after Vale back on Mandalore, yet stayed his hand for a simple reason: he wasn't convinced he stood a chance in a direct confrontation, and the very thought of risking Satine then brought pain. Now, it was right there, in this room, that Obi-Wan fully comprehended why the Jedi forbid attachments. He suspected, was ready to bet even, that Vale has been Palpatine's accomplice in their desire to build an empire on the ashes of the Republic. As a Jedi, his duty would be to cut down the menace. Calmly sitting across the table, his lightsaber began quivering in anticipation, and the Force itself felt eager, yet Vale appeared unconcerned, as if he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt what the outcome of a confrontation would be. Or perhaps he knew Obi-Wan as well or better than he knew himself. After all, he was still when he should be acting. "How long did you know?" Kenobi didn't recognize his own voice in the angry hiss that escaped his lips. "Known? For a long time. Had a shred of proof? I don't even now." Vale had the audacity to shrug nonchalantly. "I must say, you can't buy this kind of show with money," a damningly familiar voice announced just as a new presence made itself known in the room. Finally, Obi-Wan was able to act. He surged to his feet, pulling Satine up and pushed her behind his back even as he stepped towards the sound of the voice. In the same time, he snatched his lightsaber and ignited it in one smooth motion, then he leveled it at the intruder. "Obi-Wan, what are you doing?" Satine exclaimed when she caught her wits and saw that her husband wasn't pointing his blade at Vale. "Did I forget to mention that Palpatine is now a Force ghost and has been haunting the general area for some time now? Those sensitive to the Force can see, hear and speak with him." Del-Katar nodded to what both women perceived as an empty space near the entrance. "Sith." Bo-Katan sighed in exasperation while Satine simply stared at the place where Obi-Wan was aiming. Kenobi could feel his wife's fear and apprehension at the very idea. "Nice to see you again, Obi-Wan." Palpatine, the Sith behind this whole mess, waved cheerfully. It was obvious that he considered this a great deal of fun, and for some reason Kenobi didn't find it surprising. He was a Sith, of course he would appreciate misery. "Congratulations to both of you." He nodded at Satine, and Kenobi instinctively took a step back to better cover her from the apparition. "Would you have believed me, Obi-Wan? Remember, I lacked tangible proof that he's a Sith." Vale actually smirked the bastard, and Palpatine snorted in amusement. "And even if you and the Jedi did believe me, do you really think that I would have helped the Council to declare an open season on the Sith?" Obi-Wan wanted to rage. To deny that the Jedi would have turned on Vale if he helped expose Palpatine. Yet the actions of the Council, the coup. Phantom pain flared at where one of his old friends cut him down during that insanity. He wanted to scream that a better man would have taken the chance, sacrificed everything to prevent more bloodshed and bring the war to swifter end. Then he remembered who he was facing. Vale certainly wasn't the better man, and in the end, why should he sacrifice himself for a Republic and Senate who kept spiting him? Obi-Wan remembered that right now neither the Republic or what passed for it, nor the Confederacy were ran by the Sith, yet there was no end to the war in sight. And just like that, his building fury deflated. I know it's hard to accept. Bo-Katan spoke in a soothing voice. We don't ask you to fight for Sith ideology or anything like that. What I implore you, Obi-Wan, is to do what's best for my sister and niece. To help us bring stability and peace to our people and the galaxy as a side effect. What about justice? Obi-Wan muttered. If you want to prosecute everyone who conspired to begin this war or profit from it, you'll need more power than anyone had ever wielded in this galaxy. And that's what we're offering Satine and you. Vale smiled wryly. You finally went over the intelligence we recovered from that ORR facility, right? You knew that for years before the war, those madmen had been infiltrating the Confederacy and maneuvering to make this war worse so the Republic would collapse. That sudden change of topic short-circuited Obi-Wan's thoughts. He had in fact went over said intelligence during a quieter period after the coup, and Vale was right about it. The picture it painted. You want to use it too, that fool Perion doesn't seek to merely bring down the Republic but reshape it in his image, and to do that he'll need to break the powers in the core. Now he is in a perfect position to influence the new Confederate leadership. They replaced Dooku and his ilk with a group of powerful and dangerous fanatics. No one had to say it out loud that along with Vale, Obi-Wan and even Satine would be primary targets for Perion. After all, from the outside it would look like they were all corrupted by the Sith. The worst thing was that Obi-Wan was beginning to think that such accusation might hold more than a grain of truth. On the bright side, as Emperor and Empress, the two of you will have the tools to keep my darker impulses in check. I might even insist you do it once the war is over. Vale suddenly went on an unexpected tangent. What brought that out? Obi-Wan suspiciously asked. Let me tell you about the stunt the dark side pulled when I engaged Perion on Kuat. That explanation and the machinations of the Force would help fuel a lot of sleepless nights for all involved. =RK=, Part 6, =RK=, representatives from over 300 of the most powerful still Republic-aligned systems in the galaxy converged to Coruscant in the aftermath of the Skyfall. They came in a response of summons issued by Chancellor Kenobi, General Kenobi and General Vale acting in his position as Mandalore. The agenda? Deciding how to preserve the Republic and end the war on favorable terms, something understood at the time as seeking Confederate unconditional surrender. At least that was the official agenda. The details of the summons themselves are to this day classified within the Empire, with non-aligned and hostile powers constantly speculating. However, certain assumptions and conclusions can be drawn, especially now when we have the benefit of hindsight. Highly placed officials from Alzakan, Anaxes, Corellag, Samas, Euphornis, Brental and many more powerhouses within the core. Even occupied systems like Duro and Corellia had representatives in the summit, and they were rumored to be amongst the first to back up the newly formed Imperial faction and their drive to consolidate power. Rise of an Empire, the Coruscant Summit. =RK=, Chancellor Residence. Senate Building. Coruscant. Obi-Wan didn't know what to think. Too many worldview-shattering revelations coming in too fast, no doubt just like Vale intended. For him the Force has always been an ally. He wanted to think that what the Sith experienced at Kuat was merely an artifact of the dark side. That very well might have been the case too, but could he take the chance? His mind drifted towards the more esoteric teachings about the Force he had overheard during conversations with older and more experienced Jedi Master. Tried to remember all he knew about the nature of the Force itself, and already knew his understanding woefully lacked. Perhaps the holocrons left behind by the Jedi before they ran might be of help. If, when he found the time to go over them. What was that saying? That the real conflict, the real war the Jedi would ever fight would be against the dark side and the Sith? Something to that effect anyway. If that was how the Council saw things, even if the Force itself didn't influence them and push them to act against the Sith, then he could almost understand their actions. For a moment he could almost see where they came from, yet the man who he was today couldn't accept their reasoning. Or could he? He was considering Vale's proposition, something he should have rejected out of hand. Obi-Wan wondered how far could one fall before there was no turning back and he couldn't recognize himself. He had to worry about the Force, those old Republic Jedi fighting for the Separatists, the Sith, those in the room included, the Jedi who managed to escape Order 66, even those who might still be loyal. At least until they saw where Vale wanted to lead the galaxy. That was the real war, or at least a very real conflict that had to be fought and dealt with. Yet, Obi-Wan wasn't sure it was more important than the war with the Confederacy. They were connected, and it was clear that you couldn't win one of those wars but lose the other, unless you lost yourself, which unfortunately was a very real danger. Force, he was a living example of it. "Satine, what do you think?" he asked wearily. Obi-Wan's wife stirred and gave him a bleary-eyed stare. "I can't speak about the Force and people who should have stayed dead," she snipped in Palpatine's general direction, and her predecessor rolled his eyes. The former Chancellor was too busy discussing with Vale how best to make multiple powerful governments back the rise of an empire, and damningly from what Kenobi could gather, it sounded perfectly doable. "What do you know about Compa?" Palpatine asked. "Some of its members are your fans, including Ryloth's senator, who the last time I checked was still live and kicking." Obi-Wan recalled something like that being mentioned by some officers back in HQ. Wasn't it an organization busying itself with spreading propaganda to support the war effort? He tuned out the Sith and looked back at Satine, who he cradled in his arms. Due to his brief distraction, Obi-Wan missed some of her words. "I'm spent, Obi-Wan. I'm tired of all this pointless toil. Everything I've done as a Chancellor has been for nothing." Satine seethed. "I can see it clearly, the illusion of the Republic slipping through my grasp and shattering, and with it, Mandalore will follow. Was it always this bad, here on Coruscant? If you asked me this question a year ago..." Obi-Wan trailed off. "I'm not sure if everything that happened since then twisted me. Perhaps it did, or those experiences merely opened my eyes. Those same people we met with over the past couple of days, their governments, they're the same who existed before the war began. What they want from you, from us, those ambitions and interests had to be around for a long time." He glared at the Sith. "Otherwise he wouldn't have come so close to achieving his empire. Then my efforts to keep things together were doomed from the start. I think I always know it might turn this way, yet. I was desperate, Obi-Wan. I saw what the Civil War did to my people, then Grievous and Vizsla's goons, and now the Separatists. I am still desperate, and for my people," her voice broke. "I'm ready to make another deal with the devil." She was looking at Vale and the empty space where Palpatine's ethereal visage spoke with a glam in his eyes. Obi-Wan hugged his wife closer and glared at the Sith. Palpatine caught his eye and gave him a knowing look. It was at that moment, when Obi-Wan didn't know who despised more, the not-so-dead man who began the war, Vale for being the harbinger of doom, the Separatists for existing, or all the politicians in the Corps minus Satine for nearly driving Satine to a nervous breakdown while she was pregnant, no less. Duty and emotions clashed within his heart, and while all he wanted was to pick up his wife and disappear somewhere far away from this chaos, he knew she would never accept running. Mandalore, her people, they meant that much to Satine. It was no real choice that he had in the end, and Obi-Wan hated that too. What do we need to do? It was such an innocent question, and with it, Kenobi knew he just sold his soul to the Sith. The things we do for love and duty. Vale looked him in the eyes for a long moment, then his gaze fell upon Satine's form and his eyes softened, something that shocked Obi-Wan. Their eyes met and an understanding passed between them. There was something odd in the Sith today. He seemed more open, more human, which had to be a deception. Or perhaps what the dark side did affected him this much. Kenobi didn't know any more. "It's decided then." Whatever that moment was, Palpatine's gleeful voice shattered it. The bastard of a Sith clapped joyfully too. "First thing we need to address is whose support we absolutely must have. And with that, the man who engineered the downfall of the Republic began to explain exactly what made it possible. Needless to say, the lecture that followed was enlightened and made Obi-Wan wonder why in the name of the Force he ever felt he needed to protect the bloody thing. He had to remind himself that while it might have been almost by accident, the Republic did manage to bring an unprecedented age of peace and prosperity before petty politics drove it straight to the Sith. RK equals Strategic Planning Amphitheatre, Coruscant. This was one grand ancient building, the military seat of the old Republic no less. The place was taken out during the sack of Coruscant, then painstakingly rebuilt, and if it wasn't for my mishap above Korriban that sent me to this future, it would have been one of 3 primary targets when I led an Imperial conquest fleet to seize Coruscant and finally end the war. Walking through the halls of this building, just like being within the depths of the Jedi Temple and the Chancellor's office in the Senate, once upon a time that would have been a sign of triumph, a proof that we had won the Forever War. Today? Actually, it was almost as good. The Sith in me rejoiced at what I was doing. The Republic was dead, torn by internal divisions, and now, I was busy setting the foundations of an empire. Though not a Sith one. That was the last thing the galaxy or I needed. Still, I took a moment to relish being here today before Obi-Wan's stiff presence brought me back to the present. We were about to meet with a number of important GAR officers, both Army and Navy. Coburn, Yularen, Valentra, hell, most of the current general staff working for Obi-Wan would be attending. Meanwhile, Satine held a grand meeting with civilian members of Compa, and once she has gained their support, or failed in her task, she along with Anara would be entertaining a delegation from Alzakan. The gears were in motion now, and we had mere days to persuade hundreds of governments to see things our way. If it wasn't for the setup done by Palpatine, it would be an impossible task. Frankly, without his support it would have been a very long shot, and even with it, it was far from sure thing. We had our ducks in a row for when the time came to meet the politicians tonight. The plan was audacious, held a great deal of deception too, and certainly was something born from a Sith-sick mind. It might very well work too. Now, however, it was time to make sure that the military would support our scheme if we gained political backing. We reached a set of ornate wooden doors, and the guards swung them open to reveal a large auditorium. The place was shaped like an amphitheater, one of the reasons for the name in fact, with rows of seats rising up on steps above a central podium for the speakers. Over 100 general and flag officers stood in small groups, and the first thing that dubbed this meeting as exceptional was the complete lack of aides or the expected smattering of colonels, captains and commanders that should have surrounded those men and women. Supreme Commander on deck. A sergeant announced when we entered. The proceeded to seal the doors behind us, and the room went dark and secure from outside interference. At ease. Take your seats, we have some grave issues to go over. Kenobi ordered. And so it began.